Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. It's me again, Zach, that guy that plays Barony sometimes. Today, in light of the soon-to-be released Eat My Hat update for Barony, I decided to start doing some more Barony content. I was already feeling the desire to play the game, so works out, good time. I'm going to be putting out some beta videos of that soon, but for today we're going to be doing something slightly different. I haven't done this for Barony yet. I thought this would be kind of interesting to do, and that is a series of tier lists about various aspects of Barony, starting with one of the most seemingly basic but complicated parts of the game, which is the species or races options at the very start. Whenever you're making your character, you choose two things predominantly, other than, of course, your silly name, the most important part. Part 1 is your race, and Part 2 is your class. In most games, your race, your species, whatever, doesn't make a whole lot of difference. It might lean you in a specific way, but that's about it. Barony is a bit different. Barony has some pretty impactful decisions to make. It's important to note that I say decisions because this is not necessarily a tier list, and you could probably see this from how I've kind of laid these out over here, the different tiers. It is not a decision that will make or break your character, first off. Any race, any species, any class, anything like that can be anything in this game with enough elbow grease in a similar way to like Bethesda titles. But unlike Bethesda titles, what you are, who you are, matters quite a bit still, especially in the early game. So when I'm weighting these between inconsistent and consistent, it mostly comes down to how good their early game is. Your late game, if you're playing well in Barony, you're going to be a god. All right, it just is what it is. You just become incredibly powerful. It becomes almost impossible for you to lose the game. Early game, though, you can get smeared by a dedicated gnome instantly with some classes. And races, etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of mark these out. Like I just said, a lot of this is weighted towards the early game, especially for the Gnomish Mines. So this is not a tier list for super high level players because they don't give a shit. All right, they might find this interesting, but they can do anything they want. All right, if you're really good at Barony, congrats, you can do anything. That play whoever, win the game. You know what you're doing. Newer players, some of this might be a bit advanced. If you're like brand new to the game, you're probably still scared of gnomes. Embrace that. Truly live with that fear of the gnomish mines. Allow that to suffuse your whole being because you will be scared of them for most of your life. But overcoming the gnomish mines is such a massive advantage. My friends and I, when we play Barony, we consider it mandatory. If we cannot make it through the gnomish mines, we restart the game. So when I say early game, I mostly mean the Gnomish Mines and sort of that whole section of the game. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the human. I'm going to put him here for now. We're going to talk about him. All right. Human overall. No abilities. It's perfectly average. We're actually moving him down here immediately. Human doesn't do anything special. They are just average across the board. The only interesting thing about them that I will note is that they can start as any class. All right, most races, except the human, has a racial class that only they can play to start with the exception of humans who can play as anything. So they're perfectly average. They're bog standard. They don't have a weak early game because they don't have a strong early game or a strong late game or a weak late game. They just are. They are perfect for starting out the game in many ways. They are perfect for learning classes before you try and take on the added weight of a race, right? So I just wanted to get them out of the way because they are the standard. I don't consider them to be weak. As you can see, the green tier is average, which stands for average. They're perfectly fine, and that's it. I see that a lot of people with many hours in the game, a lot of higher level players, seem to enjoy going back to humans purely for that fact. So don't take this as any kind of like reason to not play this race. All right? But we got them out of the way because I mean, just look at this guy. What's he gonna do? Nothing. Now we'll do alphabetical order, starting with the Automaton. Again, we'll move them into consistently good. So, Automaton, what do? Well, they don't eat normal food. They have to eat metal scrap. They start with a spell that allows them to break objects, predominantly weapons and armor, but other things as well, into scrap or magic scrap. You can eat either, and it will refill your boiler. Maintaining your boiler is very important. It does a few things. One, I mean, if you lose all the heat in your boiler, you get slowed massively, which is a big bummer. And I think if hunger's turned on, I think you start dying if your boiler reaches 0. So that's a bummer. Don't do that. In addition, they're immune to the burning effect, which is pretty good. It's not super common. You still die in lava, but when you are on fire, it fills your boiler heat. So that's kind of cool. You can eat scrolls of fire to get maxed out boiler stats, which is neat. I mean, that's pretty cool. Another effect of these guys is they're immune to cursed items. They still take negatives when wearing or equipping them, but they don't. They're not locked in. They can take them off, is what I'm trying to say, which is pretty good because what you can do is early game if you and your friends. I kind of am leaning this towards multiplayer, but it's good for single player too. But if you and your friends don't have any good appraisers on your team because you are bad at planning out your groups, then this guy can just equip stuff, check his stats, and be like, ah, yeah, that's a cursed fucking ring. Whatever, take it off. Pretty neat, right? I don't remember if they're immune to amulets of strangulation, actually. Huh. Well, whatever. You'll start noticing when you start dying. They aren't great at swimming because swimming lowers the heat in their boiler, but they don't die from it directly the way that other races might. Vampire. Uh, so their weaknesses are relatively easy to overcome. So I definitely think they're consistent. They've got that strong early game of not really having any particular weaknesses. I guess one thing kind of worth noting is they're weak to a couple, because I think they're weak to axes, like the damage from axe type weapons, which does mean that skeletons can be a bit spooky if you run into an axe skeleton, since axes cannot be fully blocked by shields or anything that you're blocking with, basically. Which is a bit spooky, but not really consistently a problem, so who cares, right? When they die, they explode, so if you've got friendly fire on, don't stand next to your friend while he's feeding. The weaknesses are basically non-existent. They're immediately consistent right out of the gate. But where do they go on the other axis, right? Are they great? Are they good? Are they average? Well, that's easy. They're consistently great. They're possibly the best race in the game. They're totally fine in melee, totally fine with ranged. They don't have to worry about food. If you're playing with no hunger, which is how I play, because I think it makes the game more difficult, weirdly enough, uh, they can eat food to get HP back, but that's it, right? They don't need to eat food either way. They eat scrap, and scrap can be made out of things like cursed items you don't want to use. They can use cursed items if it's more valuable than not doing that, if that makes sense. If you have a cursed item, but it has some kind of neat effect, like for instance, an amulet of Olympic swimming that's cursed, might still make you fast in the water, might be worth equipping to get you through it as fast as possible, right? Since you don't want to be in the water for long as these guys regardless. But the other big thing about them that really moves them from consistently good to consistently great is when your boiler is maxed out, when it is full, you can get it to the point where it is overcharged, right? It goes from yellow to blue flames. And when you get it to that point, it gives you boosted mana regen, which means that not only are they perfectly adequate in all areas of the game, they're very good at tinkering, which is one of the more powerful uh, non-combat skills you can raise. They also happen to be really good at casting spells. They're one of the top 3 best spellcasters in the game. Just kind of innately. Arguably the best, but that is arguable, of course. And as I mentioned, because I just said that thing about tinkering, I kind of forgot about this. They count as 20 levels higher for the purposes of repairing things innately. I think it's 20. So they're right out of the gate good at tinkering, which is really powerful, and good at spell casting, which is very powerful, and perfectly fine at melee and ranged and all the other combat stuff that you'd want them to be good at. So absolute S tier. They're pretty good. Love those guys. Now, next up is the Insectoid. And the Insectoid is actually going to go inconsistently good. The Insectoid has a couple minor flaws, but starting off by talking about their strengths here, they can eat pretty much any food. If it's not cursed, they can eat it. So like moldy, spoiled, old, aged, whatever, doesn't matter. They do not care about the age of the cream pie, only that there is a cream pie, right? This is pretty good right out of the gate. This, in a similar way to the Automaton, where if you're playing in multiplayer, you can throw your Automaton friend cursed gear that you don't want to use, and he'll eat it like a freak. If you have an Insectoid in your party, you can eat the good food, and he can eat the garbage, right, and get his daily dose of penicillin. This helps him out because he doesn't have normal hunger mechanics either. We'll get to that in a minute. In addition, Insectoids have decent resistances to weapons and stuff. I don't remember them offhand, but they're fine. Like, they're nice. Um, in addition to that, they have 3 racial spells that they start with, right? One is Flutter, which is a weak, short-term levitate. Perfectly fine for anything you're going to be doing early on, but not crazy powerful late game when maybe having the other one would be more useful. They also have, I think it's called Dash. My brain just kind of like shorted out there for a second, but they have an ability that dashes them forward. It breaks through walls and, or sorry, not walls, doors, not walls, doors. That's important. They can break through doors with that, and not super, it's not like a super long dash, but it's not exactly short either. It's a good gap closer or escape tool. I never really used it much for escape when I played Insectoid a little bit, but my friend who played quite a bit more than me seemed to get good value out of it. You can kind of hit an enemy, turn, dash away, all in like one move if you get the timing down. So all of that's pretty good, right? They're pretty fantastic. In addition, I should note this. Uh, they are the first group that has kind of a unique alliance system. I kind of forgot to mention this with the other two. Humans can only make friends with humans and automatons. There are not many automatons in the game, but if you find them, you can make friends with them. And automatons can make friends with humans and automatons. So another reason why the automatons up here is they're the only monstrous race that is friendly with shopkeepers innately. Okay? So they can do trading stuff, they can do all that kind of stuff, as well as still having all the benefits of being a monster. In addition, in the early floors, there are a lot of humans, and they can be kind of spooky when you're like level 1 or 2. So these guys can make friends with them and lead them to their certain doom. Insectoids are the first ones that are not connected to humans or automatons, though I'm pretty sure this is true. Everyone can make friends with automatons. So that's not really saying anything. The Insectoid can make friends with a lot of weirdos, though. First off, in the desert part of the map, they can absolutely make friends with other Insectoids. That's pretty good because at that point in the game, those guys hit like dump trucks. All right. In addition, they can make friends with Scarabs, which are tanky little fuckers, but otherwise nothing special, and Scorpions, which mixed bag. What this is cool for, really, is that they can make friends with the mini bosses. So you've got, I don't remember their names exactly, but there's a Scorpion and a Scarab mini boss. I think the Scorpion is like Scarbrand or something. I think that's a Warhammer 40k demon actually, but yeah, there are 2 mini bosses in the temple area that you can make friends with if your leadership is high enough. Uh, which is pretty powerful, having them following you around. They're not insanely good, but the Scarab will spam cold spells at people, which is toxic and fantastic. So it is pretty good. It's sort of a mid-game power spike. Insectoids fall off pretty hard after you get into the post-Baron content, so eh. But overall, because of these bonuses, I say consistently good, right? They're pretty much no matter what, they're good. However, why are they not great? Why are they not consistently great? The answer is they're not very good at magic because of their unique hunger mechanics. Instead of having normal hunger, they have an energy bar, which also is their mana bar. This is capped at 50. So right out of the gate, if a spell costs more than 50 mana to cast, they just can't cast it, ever. And even if they can cast it, if it's something like magic mapping, which I believe is 45 mana on the nose, I could be wrong about that though, uh, it's basically their entire energy bar. When their energy bar gets too low, they start taking stat penalties, and of course if you're playing with hunger on and your energy bar runs out, um, you start dying, you see. So casting spells as a bug boy is doable, but you have to be very careful. Right, you have to kind of stick to a limited selection, let's say. They're not awful because of this, but certain classes will actually sort of hamstring them in the long term. A good example of this being uh, the Conjurer class, because you get the Summon Skeleton ability, which is innate, and they can cast it at first, but by the end of the game, I'm pretty sure they lose the ability to even cast it because it costs so much mana. I could be wrong about that, but um, that is what I remember reading at one point. I therefore never played an Insectoid Conjurer because I don't want to die. But not having access to becoming a powerful spellcaster without serious elbow grease really makes me move them down to only being in good. And I mean only, right? Like they're still really good. They're great at melee, and they have access to the hunter subclass from the beginning of the game. I say subclass, sorry. The hunter class, which is one of the best ranged options, and in general, they're pretty good at range stuff. They have a lot of ways to sort of get to weird positions and hit enemies with ranged attacks when the enemies can't hit them back. So overall, consistently good. No access to magic kicks them out of great tier pretty much immediately, but I think they're fine. I think they're overall good. They've got a strong mid-game spike. They've got an okay late game. Their early game is variable, but pretty good. The I forgot to mention their third spell, which is Poison Spray, which they can use to kite things like trolls and other tough enemies around, which is pretty powerful. As long as you manage your energy bar fine, you're good. They're a good class, consistently good even. Next up is Goat Boy. Now, Goatmen have lots of weird stats. I'm not going to give solid numbers on everything here, but basically, they are hungover whenever they are sober, which is sort of a weird sentence to say out loud, but it is how it works. Which means that if you have not drank alcohol recently, they are not great. Now, you can cure that ailment with potions or spells, so it's not the end of the world, but it's not ideal, I guess. While drunk, however, right, so I had some microphone issues there for a second, sorry about that. If that cut is jarring, that is why. Goatman, while drunk, however, gets massive stat boosts to their physical stats and detriments to their mental stats. I say that in quotes. Um, like their int, I believe the charisma, I think just all three of them actually just get hit with a little bit of a deficit. It's not huge, but still, it's noticeable. And in addition, they get damage resistance during that time, which means they're just tankier than everyone else, essentially. In addition, Goatmen have access to uh, a weird potion-based ability. which is that whenever they drink from a fountain, or whenever they use an empty bottle on the fountain, they have a really high chance to basically proc a burst of bonus potions coming out of it, which is, for an alchemist class, very strong, right? For anyone else, it's useful, especially because they are often the alcohol that you need, right, to get those damage boosts, or the damage resist boosts, I should say, which is pretty good. Definitely a neat little ability. It's inconsistent, but I found that when I say inconsistent, it's not that inconsistent, really. Like, it happens a couple times a run, for sure. In addition to that, uh, they have what I would say is probably the biggest array of potential allies of any race in the game. I think there's only one race that comes close to them in that sense, but you can, if you toss alcohol at a human, or if you toss alcohol at a succubus or an incubus, you can make friends with any of them. So that's three different groups. You, of course, can be friends with automatons, because everybody can be. And you can be friends with other goatmen. So in total, what is that? 5? Yeah, you can be friends with 5 out of the races. I don't think goblins work. Neither do skeletons or vampires or insectoids. Not sure about the goblin thing, actually. Let's forget. But 5 races out of the 9 is pretty fucking good. And definitely is something to worthy of note, though the obvious caveat to that I should note here is that that means giving up alcohol that you could use to get really powerful, right? So is it worth it? That is obviously entirely up to you, but it's definitely strong in the right circumstances, right? Now, weaknesses of the Goatman. Actually, before we talk about weaknesses, let's put him where he goes. Inconsistently good. Now, why is that? That was a lot of positives, and some of them sounded pretty dope, right? Well, they're sort of a feast or famine race, in my experience. If you get a good first couple levels, 10 out of 10. However, they struggle in the gnomish mines. Why? They have a 40% weakness to magic. That means most of the time, by the time you get to the gnomish mines, they are in one-shot range. You do not get the grace of 2 shots from a lightning staff to survive. You just fucking die, alright? You just keel over dead and explode. Which is really rough because, again, making it through the gnomish mines is sort of not necessary, but really handy for early game barony. In addition, there are plenty of other magic enemies that is a giant pain to deal with. And getting magic resist up before the desert area, where the insectoids are, is rough. Now, once you get to Sokoban and you complete the puzzle, you get the gloves, and that overcomes your weakness a little bit. But the fact that you need that is just kind of sad. Like, at one point, I considered goatmen to be worse than humans, honestly, because it felt like their early game was so dependent on getting lucky, essentially. And if you're not playing as a healer, you don't get access to cure ailments super early, and that can really put a limit on just how fun they are to play, even if you're constantly hungover and dealing with that and you don't get enough alcohol and stuff. Are they good? Absolutely. They're late game. When you get to the late game, you probably have enough money, you probably have enough trade skill, etc. You can end up with more than enough alcohol to make it through, or you get the cure ailment spell and you just don't have to care. And in that late game, the tankiness of the Goatman really shines through. You knock back a cold one, crack open a cold one with the boys, and you just go in and, tank 4 bosses by yourself. But up until that point, it can be a little bit painful, right? So very strong late game, average mid game, but weak early game makes me consider them to be pretty inconsistent because you really can just get shut down, and that doesn't feel good. So next up is Goblin. Goblins are one of the more interesting races, and I find them very hard to rate, actually. So what I'm going to do with the Goblin is move them where I think they go, and then we're going to talk about it. And it's going to be kind of weird, but I think Goblins are actually average. I think Goblins are in kind of a bad place right now. I think they need a little bit of a balanced tuning, and I don't say that lightly because I think most of the classes and races in this game are really well balanced, all things considered. And it should be noted that goblins can get very powerful late game. I could see an argument for inconsistently good even. But here's the issue. Let's start with their strengths, okay? Because I think that that's only fair to them. First off, they lose item durability quite a bit slower. Any type of equipment, I should clarify, it's equipment durability. Armor, utility slots, weapons, and equipped spellbooks and staffs, or staves, all are affected by this. So they all lose durability much slower when wielded by a goblin versus anybody else. In addition, when a goblin levels up any melee skill, it levels up all of their melee skills. So if you're punching and you get your punch to level 10, all your other skills go up to level 10. All of the melee weapon ones, at least. Pretty good. But that's it, pretty much. They have mediocre resistances. They're not even very tanky. They actually, I think they have 4 weaknesses and only 2 resistances, or maybe 3 resistances, which is not ideal for a melee-focused class, in my opinion. I contrast this with the Goatman, who is weak to magic, which makes him inconsistent, but the Goatman's advantage is that he can go into berserk drunk mode and just take no damage, which is pretty dope. Whereas the Goblin, I mean, his cool thing is that he can switch between weapons, I guess, and it's like pretty equally effective. But is that good? Well, let's talk about their weaknesses now and kind of compare and contrast here. What is the Goblin weakness? They cannot learn spells. They cannot learn spells. The only spells they have access to are so-called innate spells. So if you start the game as a conjurer goblin or a shaman goblin, the spells that those classes start with, you know, right? You can summon skeleton, and in the case of the shaman, you can shapeshift. However, the conjurer also starts with a spellbook of slow. You can never read this. You can never learn this spell. You can cast from the book, or you can get a staff and cast from that, but you can never actually learn the spell. Which means if you want to do magic as a goblin, you can. They have average, like they have perfectly fine mana and everything else, but like, why would you? It would just make your entire inventory into a nightmare. And that really is the kicker. A goblin always has to be carrying multiple of anything that they want to use to get real value out of it. You want to take advantage of their cool axing abilities? Well, you got to carry an axe. Well, if you also level up your polearm at the same time and you run into an enemy that's weak to polearms, maybe you want to use that. Well, now you have to carry at least one polearm around with you. And that's kind of a bummer. But there's a further reason why I think that they are a little bit weak, and by weak I mean they're just average, in the current build of the game, and it's because you can truly get every artifact, weapon, and armor piece in the game, and you get most of the important ones pretty early on, right? Like you can get the Parashu axe on level 1, hypothetically, and once you have that, it's cool that you can use it. It's cool that you can level up your axe skill even if you started as somebody with no axe skill. But like, your goblin ability to extend the durability of items is worthless now because you're using legendary items that don't have durability. So, in my opinion, I think that what makes the goblin good is if you play very specific classes with them. A good example, in my opinion, is the monk, because the monk often suffers from not being able to find really good gauntlets, and they don't want those gauntlets breaking. And oftentimes they don't even want to use the Sokoban bracers because they need a punching item. And the goblin will extend that durability massively, right? So I think they're good on monk, and there's a handful of other cleric is pretty good. Is it cleric? Now part of me thinks it's called paladin. I think it's cleric though. The cleric class, they're actually pretty good with the shaman class because what you can do is stay in goblin form and level up your weapon, like your melee weapon skills as normal, switch to a troll and just cut someone in half with a level 50 punch because you were hitting dudes with a sword for 3 floors. Not bad. It also gives them access to spells in the form of the Imp once you get to that point. And of course, should be noted, the Shaman is their racial class, so they have access to that from the start of the game. If you beat the game as a Skeletone, or as a Conjurer at least, you can also access the Conjurer for them. And unlike Insectoids, uh, Conjurer is a pretty good class for a Goblin. You get the one spell you care about, which is Summon Skeleton, and otherwise you let the Skeleton tank and you just punch dudes and get your melee skills up. And Conjurer is a fairly tanky mage class as far as all things go anyway, so you can get pretty beefy by the end of the game. It's not bad, and that's what I want to stress here. I will say the Goblin is better than the human in my opinion. Like there are playstyles you can do with the Goblin that sort of compensate for their weaknesses. So don't try not to take away from this that I think Goblin is trash tier. It belongs like off screen. It's so bad or anything. It's just a bit weak. I think it's not quite like I think it's supposed to be the melee king, right? I think it's supposed to be S tier for melee boys, but because of how everything kind of works out, I don't really see it. You know. And that's a bummer because I would like there to be that. They almost feel like they're supposed to be the spellcasters of Melee, right? Where instead of having 1,000 spells that you swap between, they have 1,000 weapons that they swap between. It just ends up not being all that ideal, in my opinion. The biggest thing that keeps them from being weaker than the human, though, is the fact that they have a pretty strong mid game. Because when you get to the swamp, 99% of enemies are El Goblino. And that means that you can get a big old goblin posse going and beat the shit out of anybody that dares stand before you. And that's pretty cool, albeit it's also kind of fine. Like, it's whatever. It's basically like a slightly earlier but weaker form of the Insectoids ally pop-off move. It's fine. It's nothing special, but overall, I do think that early game, the Goblin is above the Goatman. He's like here. But as the game goes on, he just keeps falling. So I put him in average. I don't think he's weak, but I don't think that they're great. So, moving on to the Incubus. Now, the Incubus is one of the races that I think people like a lot. um, so this might be a little bit controversial. I see a lot of people putting this guy in S tier. I'm gonna put him in inconsistently great. I think that the Incubus has a less interesting early and mid game than its counterpart, the Succubus. Honestly, I think that the Incubus, the Arcane Mark spell that they start with is good. The the other spell that I've forgotten the name of offhand, uh, what, teleport other, I think. I don't know. I, as you can tell, I don't get much use out of it. There are playstyles that you could build around it, absolutely, but I find that the Arcane Mark spell is the one that is actually good compared to their secondary one. The Arcane Mark spell removes all resistances from an enemy, which is good in single player if you're playing as a mage because you can strip late game magic resist heavy enemies of their magic resist and then pummel them to death with spells and arcane power. But it's also good in multiplayer because you can just hit any big enemy with it, and if they resist your allies' weapons or their spells or whatever, you're helping out your whole team, which is pretty good. Also good when you play with like a lot of followers. Um, the other Incubus abilities are A, exactly like the Succubus. In fact, I'm going to move the Succubus here. We'll just talk about both of them because they're literally, when you swap genders on either of these races, it swaps to the other race. They are distinct race and also gender. So both of them benefit from cursed items. So instead of taking a penalty when you equip a cursed item, you get the curse's level as a bonus the same way that you would with blessed equipment. The caveat to that is you cannot remove blessed equipment, but it should be noted you do in fact still get a bonus from it. So it is worth it to equip really good blessed items, right? Like artifact armor, for instance, because who cares about removing it? It's artifact armor. You're going to wear it the whole fucking game. Contrast this with the Goblin's ability. And instead of their bonuses getting in the way of artifact equipment, it actually still benefits them. It just adds in like one tiny hiccup if they happen to need to switch to a different item. It basically means they don't get to use artifact weapons very much, though, which is a small problem, but it's not that big of a deal, all things considered. Um, Incubi and Succubi both resist magic, I believe. They have decent resistances all over the place anyway. The Incubus is able to befriend other Incubi, Automatons, and Succubi. That's it. Um, those are somewhat rare, but you can occasionally get some Succubi early on in the game if you drink out of fountains. Of course, drinking out of fountains also occasionally blesses your equipment, which is bad for you. So, bit of a mix. They're pretty good as mages though, because they have arcane marks, so they don't have to worry about magic resist. They're pretty good as melee. Their racial class is fine. The Punisher class, I think it's a pretty high skill class compared to a lot of other ones, but it's not bad. It has a unique weapon. We're not going to go into it here. We'll talk about it in the class tier list I'm planning on doing soon. But all things considered, the Incubus is solid. Very solid. The reason I put it in inconsistent is I think that it's a little bit weaker early game. You can't interact with shopkeepers. You can't make friends with humans. You can't, like, using blessed or cursed equipment and all that. It can be a bit of a mixed bag early on, just depending on how you play things out. And one of your racial spells, I think, is kind of meh. Like, it's gimmicky and cool, and you could definitely build around it, but I don't think most people will, I guess is my issue. So moving to the Succubus specifically now, we already talked about most of her abilities when we talked about the Incubus. What makes her different is a few things. One, she can befriend drunk humans, possibly goatmen as well. I actually don't remember that one offhand, but I know she can make friends with drunk humans, incubi, succubi, and automatons. Succubus overall has the second best, after the Goatman, the second best ally, like array of anybody, in my opinion, which I think automatically puts her equal to this guy. However, I actually think she's consistently great. I think she's the weakest in consistently great, but I think she deserves to be up here instead of here. And the reason for that is because her early game is really solid. The only thing she has to worry about is like blessed versus cursed equipment and stuff like that, same as the Incubus does. However, pretty early on within the first 3 levels, you can get access to your second racial spell, which is Polymorph. One of them is Teleport. Teleport's mixed bag. Generally not useful, sometimes handy, but most of the time, Polymorph is the star here. So a lot of people compare Arcane Mark to Polymorph. Arcane Mark is useful throughout the whole game, right? Polymorph doesn't really feel like it is. Where is Polymorph useful? Well, it's really handy to have directly after the Baron fight. It's really handy to have right after the Gnomish Mines if you happen to get Minetown. It's really handy to have if you just want to level up your trade abilities, right? Even if you don't care about the effects of the trade skill, it's free levels, baby. As opposed to Arcane Mark, which is fine, but Polymorph just, I have found, comes in handy way more often. Teleport, I think, is also slightly more useful than the teleport. I think it's called Recall, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. But the Incubus bone effect is just not as good as Teleport, in my opinion. And that's not saying much because both of them kind of suck. But all things considered, I consider the Succubus to just be overall more robust. I consider Succubus to be the third best option for a spellcaster in the game. Um, it's sort of weird, but they kind of come off as being a bit tanky. They don't have a ton of very obvious weaknesses. You can still wear the artifact helmet, which is the most important gear piece for a spellcaster, just in general. You don't really care about the other artifact pieces as much. If you get the gloves on them, the Sokoban gloves, they are very tanky, frankly, and that's pretty cool. They're just overall very solid. They're not, like, again, they're consistent, right? They're not very swingy. They're just pretty good all the time. Even their like really early game is not bad, because they can just pick up and use cursed equipment if you get it. But if you get blessed equipment, they can also use that if they have to. So I just think they're good. Succubus is one of my favorite races to play as. Um, and honestly, tier list might be a little bit biased, in case you hadn't noticed. But uh, we'll move on to the skeleton now. Skeleton's a bit of a weirdo. There's a couple things to note about the skeleton that I honestly have never heard anyone else talk about. We'll start with the obvious stuff. They got good resistances. I think they are one of the very few people that have 4 resistances right out of the gate and like hardly any weaknesses. I think their only early game weakness is polearms, I believe, because they're weak to blunt damage just like in D&D. And there aren't that many polearm boys early on. Like, skeletons mostly use swords and axes, which I think they resist both of, so thumbs up. Oh yeah, because they're also weak to maces. That's like the only thing you have to worry about early game. Um, However, skeletons don't need to eat. That's pretty dope. In addition, they can eat slightly bad food if you're playing with the no hunger mode on, it seems like, because you can still eat to regain your HP, just like the Automaton. You just pop some food in, and it heals your bones up. You get some calcium from that meat, I guess. But not needing to worry about hunger is pretty good, especially if you're playing in a group. Because, again, similar to how you can toss the Insectoid friend some bad food, you can toss the Automaton old scrap. With the skeleton, you just toss them nothing except your friendship, and they're just happy with that. However, what about when you don't have hunger turned on? I've seen people put them tiers lower than they deserve to be because of the simple fact, okay, that the skeleton does not regen or does not benefit from having hunger turned off. And that's not true. The skeleton, to my knowledge, is the only race in the entire game that when you have no hunger mechanics active, regens HP. It does it very slowly, but it does it. We'll talk about its weaknesses in a second. But the fact that this guy, this little fucker, can just regenerate HP all the time in any mode, that's instantly consistent, right? So, pretty great. In addition, when you get to 75 mana, which does take quite a few levels, but when you get to 75 mana, you can expend that 75 mana upon death to instantly revive. It's basically just an amulet of life saving built into your kit. 10 out of 10. 10 out of 10, perfect ability for new players who feed a lot. So what are the weaknesses then? Why have I not already put this guy in consistently great if I think he's so fucking cool? Well, simple answer. He regenerates at 25% of the normal rate, meaning he has a minus 75% regen rate. Now, obviously, with hunger turned off, the fact that he regenerates at 25% of the normal regen rate is only a bonus. But with hunger turned on, when regen is the main way that you get HP back, it sucks. In addition, that affects your mana regen as well. And mana already regenerates pretty slowly in this game. So this guy, not a great wizard. He can do it, especially if you get the Sharur Mace later on in the game, or like a Vampire Doublet, or the Vampire Cape later in the game. All those give mana regen. That's obviously quite good. But the fact that he just doesn't do it early on does kind of suck. Not gonna lie to you. In addition, it's sort of weird. He is tanky. He resists quite a few things, but especially when you're playing with regen, well, with hunger turned on, you kind of want to play him as a ranged boy because you don't want to be taking damage because it takes you so long to recover your HP compared to, I don't want to say normal races, but all the other races basically, right? So overall, I think he's honestly perfect right here. I would kind of do it like this personally. I think the Insectoid is slightly weaker in the mid to late game, but uh, you can kind of swap them because of the final weakness of the skeleton that we have to note here, and that is their relationships suck. All right, they can be friends with automatons and ghouls. That's it. Not skeletons, not incubi or succubi, not insectoids, not goatmen, not goblins, not humans, not vampires. Nobody else. Just ghouls. Ghouls cap out pretty hard pretty early on and are not very good. In the swamp area, you can go to the castle and you can get a bunch of enraged ghouls. You might even get a couple of the oh, I can't remember the guy's name now. The ghoul mini boss is based off a character from The Walking Dead. I cannot remember his name, but you can get those guys, and they have like 300 plus HP at the time. Pretty good, but ghouls are slow. They don't do a ton of damage. They're just kind of mediocre. Like, they're good at the time you get them, but after that they fall off hard. And when you get post Baron, there's pretty much no ghouls at all. So you have to rely entirely on automatons, who mostly suck. And it's just not great, right? I think they objectively have the worst overall uh, ally like layout of anybody. The only one who kind of comes close is our next boy, but we'll talk about that in a second. Overall, like, it's just bad, you know, because you got like the Insectoid and the Goblin, the Human and the Automaton, who are all just kind of average with their allies. The Incubus is slightly better. The Succubus and Goatman are both fantastic. The Skeleton just sort of is bad at it. He just is bad at making friends. He really needs to, like, I don't know, stick to people who have the same interests, be more confident in public. I don't know. Either way, Skeleton's quite good. Good for like a melee build if you're careful, especially if you're using block effectively. Good for a ranged build if you just want to play things slow and steady. And okay for a mage build if you're willing to play for the late game. And I will make a note about mage playstyles at the end of this video, after we talk about the vampire, so stick around for that. But that brings us to our final race in the game, the vampire. This is an older picture of them when they still had their stupid buck teeth, and I love it. Look how goofy they are. Um, they're immediately going into S tier, though. Now, the reason for that is vampires honestly have pretty good strengths. They're resilient to quite a few types of damage. They are weak to water. They cannot eat normal food. So uh, in a game with hunger turned on, they can be a bit extra challenging compared to some of these other races because you only get blood from enemies that are either uh, killed by your bloodletting spell or that drop at a pretty low percentage chance randomly throughout the dungeon, right? They only drop if a vampire's in the game, to be clear. But this is sort of painful, sort of not great overall. Um, in a no hunger game, they're a little bit better because then your blood vials just give you HP back. But even then, they give you a pretty small amount of HP for how few of them you find. So overall, they can be challenging starting off. And the fact that you cannot get in water at all, or you will start to die instantly, can be very painful when you get to the swamp if you haven't been managing your resources correctly. And from that point on, water is a constant hazard, right? It's always around. So you really got to be careful. Uh, but what about their other strengths? So first off, they have two racial spells, and they are the best racial spells in the video game. Okay? One is bloodletting. First off, this is a slow. Alright? That's pretty good by itself because the frost spell's good because it slows, lets you kite. However, it also does a boatload of damage for an early game spell, and in addition to that, also bleeds the opponent, causing them to take even more damage. So overall, just really good. It's like Fireball mixed with the Frost spell. that you get access to at level 0, for God's sake. That's pretty powerful. In addition, though, it also, when enemies are killed by it or while under its bleed effect, I believe, um, basically if they die to that spell in any way, they drop a blood vial guaranteed. So you use this to kill rats and stuff early, and humans probably. And you can also move up to like trolls and stuff, or spiders. There's plenty of ways to get blood. It's not that hard once you kind of get the hang of it. It's just the learning curve is a bit steep. In addition to that, though, uh, there is the Levitate spell, which is exactly as powerful as you probably think it is. However, Levitate's weird. Unlike Flutter, which the Insectoid has, Levitate is a toggle spell. You activate it, and then it costs a certain amount of mana to upkeep. The amount of mana it costs is 1. And Levitate counts as a, I believe, master level spell. It's very high level. Maybe not master, but it's a pretty high level spell. Which means that you can just constantly cast and then uncast it, essentially, to toggle it on and off very rapidly to power level your spell casting abilities, both the casting and magic stat. Meaning you, if you are patient, can be level 100 in both casting and magic before you leave the Gnomish Mines, right? What makes this particularly crazy is because this is a racial set of abilities that they have. Those are both racial spells, not tied to class in any way. That means that these guys, as a fighter, or I mean, you can see they're all dressed as barbarians in these pictures. As a barbarian, this guy can be higher level magic and casting than a wizard by level 2, right? Now, that takes quite a bit of effort on their part, but I mean, I guess not that much effort. They're just hitting the magic button over and over again. There are some downsides to it, for sure. Again, if you're not used to them, they can feel kind of squishy when they get hit by water and then fire and then uh, pummeled to death in a corner with no way to escape. But once you get the hang of them, they're insanely powerful. They are definitely one of the top 3 magic caster types in the game. I would say these 3. Automaton's probably number 1 because they're so safe. Vampire's probably number 2 because they're so consistent. And Incubus is 3 because while they're neither of the other 2 things, they do start with Arcane Mark. So this is basically the layout, I would say. You can see there's only 2 classes I consider to be a little bit inconsistent. And then there's only 2 classes that I consider to be average. And I could see an argument for goblins going up to consistently good. Because I do think they're at least consistent, even if they're somewhat mediocre about it. But I'm going to now talk a little bit about magic in the game and how it relates to these guys, because I want to clarify some stuff. So, when we talk about the individual races here, okay? When we are talking about how good they are at magic and how important that is, there's a few things that need to be noted. One, as mentioned with the Automaton, tinkering, and as mentioned with the Goatman, alchemy are both sort of subclasses that you can play around with in this video game, right? These are very powerful aspects of the game that you can take advantage of. Why is it that I'm singling out spellcasting as something while I'm not talking about those subclasses? Well, one reason is because there's only 2 classes that directly interact with those, right? The closest otherwise is that alchemy is really good for skeletons for recovering mana early on, and that's about it. I guess tinkering is good for goblins because they don't have access to normal magic. But because neither of those 2 races really have any direct interaction with those skills, I don't really think it's worth noting. Like, it's a cool bonus thing for the Automaton to be good at repair. It doesn't really matter that the vampire doesn't get tinkering bonuses, though. You know? Like, it just doesn't, like, who cares? You can just tinker anyway. So, why spellcasting? Everybody gets access to spellcasting. Right? Anyone can find staffs and use them instantly. Anyone can find books and try to read them, except goblins, which is, of course, part of the reason why they're down here. But there's another reason why spellcasting is important. And that is because the Dominate spell is currently overpowered. It is too good. I stand by that. If any spell was going to get nerfed, it'd be Dominate. Because you can dominate anything in the game, basically. I mean, not quite, but like most normal enemies in the game, many mini bosses, like they have to protect certain things like the Cockatrice boss from being dominated because otherwise you just would be able to do that. And that is wild that that is so strong, right? It should be noted here when we talk about how powerful Dominate is that any of these classes can use it. If you get your magic skill specifically up to 100, everybody gets Dominate as an innate. That includes the Goblin, right? So functionally, if everybody dedicates to the concept of dominate gaming, okay, don't take that out of context. Um, all of these races are S tier because as soon as you get your magic to level 100, you just dominate 400 trolls and beat the Baron to death in 3 seconds, right? However long it takes for the trolls to walk up to him and hit him. Just cut him in half. The first like 3 times I beat the final boss in the game, the twins, um, was using like, I don't know, 4 cockatrices that I had dominated, like 3 crystal golems. The only boss who's somewhat resistant to it is his name's Baphomet, right? The demon boss. He's pretty resilient to spamming summons at things. But like he's also an optional side boss that's supposed to be extra difficult and there's not much reward to killing him. So yay? Question mark. Overall, I do want to note that. Like, I know that goblins can get dominate. They can also get force bolt if they get their casting up to level 100. So it is possible to do a wizard goblin playthrough without too much issue, honestly. I'm talking about how easy access to magic comes for the race overall, and if they have anything special about their race that influences it. Automatons have built-in mana regen. Vampires can start as any race and get to level 100 casting and magic in like 5 floors max, right? Uh, the Incubus gets arcane mark. Even like the Succubus and the Incubus both can learn from cursed books, like spell books, without forgetting a spell slot. They just can read any book in the game. That's awesome, right? Even like even noting that a handful of these guys are kind of bad at magic. You know, the Goatman cuts his own intelligence in order to drink more, which is realistic. The Insectoid has a limited mana pool. He just can't cast some spells. And the Skeleton doesn't have a limited mana pool, but has very limited regen. So, again, sort of held back a bit. And of course, the Goblin can't learn any spells except innate ones, so he really starts off on the back foot. But overall, I consider magic to be something fairly default. Anybody is going to want access to healing spells, cure ailment. They're going to want access to levitate or flutter at the very least. Anything like that. So having access to it is just innately better than not having access to it. In terms of the most powerful way to play the game, it's melee. Melee is the highest DPS if you know how to avoid damage, if you're good at spacing, if you know how to kite, all that. You figure those basic mechanics out. Just put a fucking stick in any of these guys' hands and beat your enemies to death. 10 out of 10, would recommend. But magic gives these guys up here an edge over these guys down here, in my opinion. And the Automaton just happens to also be good at tinkering, which is just like, I don't know, stack everything on that guy, I guess. I'm exaggerating a little bit. I don't think the Automaton is necessarily overpowered. I just think some of these guys down here, especially, not the human. The human can stay where he is, but like these two, could use a little something something to just beef him up a bit. Maybe make the Goatman slightly less weak to magic. That would be pretty cool if you did that. It would be cool if he didn't take 40% of his 40% extra damage every time he gets hit by like a dude casting sparks at him. But uh, yeah, I mean that's the tier list in a nutshell. I'm pretty happy with how this is all laid out generally. You can move some around. I could definitely see an argument for Succubus being here, and like I said, I could see Goblin being up here. And just like the disclaimer at the start of the video, I mean, don't take this as gospel. First off, never only take someone else's opinion on these sorts of things. Actually play and find out what style you like. That's the most important thing. But in addition to that, uh, these are not even tiers that are necessarily rated. Like, I would consider the Incubus to be about as good as these four, right? It's just that I think he's less consistent than them. So he's not a tier lower. He's just less consistent about it. Same with the Goatman. He's not weaker than these two classes. It's just that his early game is a little bit harder. If you learn how to play around the weaknesses of any of these classes, you can become crazy strong. If you clear the Gnomish Mines as a Goblin, you have all of their magic staffs and they last longer for you. Just fucking kill all the Goblins with magic staffs and then burn the rest into a wall somewhere and you probably get to like 60 magic and casting anyway. Just keep doing that throughout the game and ba-boom. You're 100 casting and you're 100 magic, and then you have Dominate, and you have Force Bolt, and Force Bolt is free for you, and kaboom! Like, right out of the gate, you're perfectly good. Uh, like, you can overcome any of these weaknesses. By the end, even a human with no special abilities becomes of insane godlike power. So play what you want, but when it comes to how good I think the individual races are, this is it. I think that these four are generally better than these five, and I think these two are the most consistent. I think that these ones all require a little bit of something extra. I think the Goblin requires some extra knowledge of the game to really make work. I think the Human is a good learning tool, but uninteresting. And I think the Goatman is a little bit tricky when you're starting out. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you guys found this informative. Here in the next couple days, probably the day after this goes up, there will also be a video about the races. And after that, I'm not sure. I think I might do a spell tier list as well, because I think that would be kind of interesting. But like I said, hope you guys enjoyed this. Tune in tomorrow for more Barony content, or at least in the next couple days. Unsure what the schedule is. Don't ask me. I just work here. All right. I'm sorry. Uh, don't forget, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what race is your guys' favorite down in the comments. I will talk to you next time.